The Devil of the Pearl River, Part 1. Hook, October 15, 1857. Augusta County Jail, Mississippi. The gallows stood tall, casting a long shadow across the prison yard where nearly 3,000 people gathered. They had not come for a hanging, they had come for a spectacle. The man about to die was no ordinary criminal. His name was James Copeland, and his confessions had chilled even the hardest sheriffs in the South. Before the noose was placed around his neck, Copeland calmly described murders so brutal the court stenographer had to pause, unable to keep writing through the horror. The most shocking evidence: a leather pouch filled with 43 severed human fingers, salted and carried by Copeland for over a decade. Each finger belonged to a victim. Each finger carried a story of terror. But how did a farmer's son, a man once respected, even loved, become the most feared outlaw in the Mississippi backwoods? Copeland himself explained it before his execution. And that story begins not with hate or greed, but with a simple act of kindness that turned into a curse. If you're new here, this channel tells the darkest and most mysterious stories from American history. If you love true crime and forgotten legends, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. It helps us bring more of these stories to life. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Pearl River, Mississippi 1840s. The Pearl River Valley was wild country. Cypress swamps stretched for miles, Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees, and the air was thick with the hum of insects. Alligators slid silently through black waters while steamboats carried cotton, timber, and supplies downstream to New Orleans. But the river carried more than trade. It also carried danger. Gamblers, thieves, and outlaws used the swamps as their hideouts. For settlers, life here was hard, and after dark, families barred their doors against whoever, or whatever, moved through the shadows. The Copeland family had built their homestead in 1838. Samuel Copeland, James's father, was a hard-working farmer, honest and respected in the county. His wife Martha had died giving birth to James, leaving him to be raised by his father and his Aunt Prudence. James grew into a remarkable young man. Tall, strong, and sharp-minded, he could read better than most adults and still work the land like a seasoned farmer. Neighbors admired his work ethic and often said he had his mother's gentle eyes and his father's steady hands. By the age of 19, James Copeland was one of the most admired bachelors in the Pearl River settlements. He stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. When he walked into a room, people noticed. And one person in particular noticed him, Elizabeth Hartwell. A love that changed everything. Elizabeth was the daughter of Judge William Hartwell, a wealthy plantation owner with political connections across Mississippi. She had auburn hair, striking green eyes, and, rare for the time, an independent spirit. Despite the gap in their social classes, she was drawn to James. They met at a harvest festival in Columbia in 1843. For James, it was love at first sight. Soon, every Sunday, he rode 15 miles after church just to see her. Their courtship was carefully supervised, but Judge Hartwell, after some hesitation, began to respect James's intelligence and charm. By the spring of 1844, neighbors whispered that an engagement was certain. For a brief moment, James's future seemed bright. But fate had other plans. The vanishing of Calvin Richardson. That April, the peace of Pearl River was broken. A local merchant, Calvin Richardson, vanished on his way from Hattiesburg to Columbia. He was known to be carrying nearly $800 in gold, a fortune in those days. His horse was later found wandering along the Pearl River, but of Richardson, there was no sign. Sheriff Thomas Bullock organized search parties that scoured the swamps for days. James joined them all, determined to help. Neighbors noticed his strange behavior. He worked harder than anyone in the search, but seemed distracted, often staring off into the distance with a troubled look in his eyes. Elizabeth would later recall that during those weeks, James was present in body, but his mind was far away. The truth about Calvin Richardson's disappearance remained hidden for 13 years, until Copeland's chilling deathbed confessions revealed what truly happened that April morning. A deadly meeting. James had been checking fish traps along a lonely stretch of the Pearl River. Morning fog curled around the cypress trees when he heard the sound of hooves. Out of the mist came Calvin Richardson, riding a chestnut mare and leading a mule packed with supplies. The merchant looked nervous, constantly glancing behind him. When he spotted James, relief washed over his face. "Good morning, young man," Richardson called out. "I fear I've lost my way. Can you guide me to the Columbia Road?" James pointed upriver, giving directions. But before Richardson could ride off, his horse stumbled. Richardson was thrown to the ground, his leg snapping with a sickening crack. His screams echoed through the swamp, sending birds into the sky. James rushed to his side. The injury was bad, the leg bent at an unnatural angle. Richardson, pale with pain, clutched James's arm. "Don't leave me here," he begged. "There are men following me. They mean to kill me." James froze. The nearest doctor was hours away, and carrying the man through swamp trails would be near impossible. But leaving him meant certain death. And then, from deep in the trees, came the sound of horses. Dash dash dash. The hunters appear. 3 men emerged from the mist, rough and dangerous looking. The leader was a giant with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks. The others were lean and hungry-eyed, the look of professional killers. They dismounted and studied the tracks on the riverbank. "The trail ends here," one growled. "Richardson's close," the bearded man said. He raised his voice, calling into the swamp. "Come out, merchant. We know you're here. Make it easy, and we'll kill you quick." Richardson trembled against James, whispering prayers, but his voice carried. One of the outlaws tilted his head, listening like a hound catching a scent. Slowly, he turned toward the thicket where James and Richardson were hiding. And in that moment, James Copeland's life took a turn from which there was no return. Dash dash dash. To be continued. This was just the beginning of James Copeland's story, the moment when a simple act of kindness dragged him into a world of blood, betrayal, and horror that would one day lead him to the gallows. If you want to know what happens next, don't miss part 2. And if you enjoyed this first chapter, make sure to subscribe and share, it helps us keep bringing you these forgotten tales of terror from America's past. Dash dash dash. Right finger word count. Approximately 1020 within your requested range. Do you want me to go ahead and draft part 2 in the same style about what happens when the outlaws confront Copeland and Richardson? The Devil of the Pearl River, Part 2. Hook. The crowd at Augusta County Jail in 1857 had gathered for James Copeland's execution. But what they didn't know, what only Copeland himself revealed in those final confessions, was that his path to the gallows began with a single choice. Not a robbery, not a gunfight, not even a planned murder. It began with the moment James Copeland placed his hand over a wounded man's mouth, and refused to let go. This is part 2 of The Devil of the Pearl River. If you haven't heard part 1, go back and watch it first. And if you're new here, subscribe now. We bring you the darkest true crime and forgotten history from America's past. Now, let's return to the swamps of Mississippi in 1844, where James Copeland's soul took its first step into darkness. Dash dash dash. The choice in the swamp. The merchant Calvin Richardson lay broken in the mud, his leg twisted, whispering desperate prayers. Just a few feet away, 3 outlaws prowled the riverbank, blades in hand, sniffing for their prey. "Do you hear that, Gideon?" one of them asked. The bearded leader, Gideon, smiled coldly as he drew a long knife. "Sounds like someone praying." His voice carried through the trees. "Richardson, last chance. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Make us hunt you down, and we'll take our time." Hidden in the palmetto thicket, James Copeland held his breath. He faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could reveal himself and try to fight, or stay hidden and let Richardson be tortured to death. But Richardson's prayers grew louder, trembling through the swamp. Any second now, the killers would find them. James made his choice. Instead of stepping forward, he clamped his hand tightly over Richardson's mouth. The merchant's eyes went wide with shock as James pressed harder, cutting off both breath and prayer. Richardson clawed weakly, but his broken leg made escape impossible. James held firm, his heart pounding like a drum. And then, silence. Richardson's body went limp. His lifeless eyes stared at the cypress canopy above, still open in disbelief. James lowered him gently to the ground, his hands shaking. The outlaws continued searching for another hour, cursing as they combed the riverbank. At last, they gave up, riding off into the mist. James was left alone, with a corpse, a secret, and the first terrible realization of what he had become. The gold and the finger. Kneeling beside the dead merchant, James tried to understand what he had done. And then he saw it. The saddlebags split open, gold coins spilled across the mossy ground. $800. More money than the Copeland farm would see in 5 years. James froze. Richardson was dead. No family nearby. No witnesses. The outlaws thought he had escaped. Sheriff Bullock would assume bandits or wild animals were to blame. All James had to do was take the gold and hide the body. But there was a problem. A broken leg told a story that didn't match drowning. And Richardson wore a distinctive gold ring with his initials, a piece of evidence that could trace the crime back to him. That's when James committed his first act of mutilation. Using Richardson's own knife, he cut off the merchant's ring finger. He wrapped it in a strip of cloth torn from Richardson's shirt and slipped it into his pocket. Why keep it? Even James couldn't explain. But he did, and in that moment, something inside him shifted forever. The rest of the body was dragged to the river, weighed down with stones, and pushed into the black water. Alligators would do the rest. James kept the gold, the knife, and that first severed finger. The mask of normal life. For weeks afterward, James lived 2 lives. By day, he was still the hard-working farmer, still the loyal son who made improvements to his father's land. When neighbors asked how he could afford new tools, James smiled and said he had sold some cattle. Samuel Copeland was proud, never suspecting the truth. By evening, James was still the attentive suitor, riding into Columbia to court Elizabeth Hartwell. She noticed something had changed. He was more possessive, more intense. His blue eyes, once full of warmth, had grown cold. When Elizabeth told her father she was concerned, Judge Hartwell dismissed it. All young men are jealous, he said. But Elizabeth sensed something darker at work. Meanwhile, James carried that cloth bundle in his pocket wherever he went. Richardson's finger. A secret trophy. The preacher's mistake. 5 months passed. Then, in September 1844, death returned to the Copeland farm. A traveling preacher named Reverend Fleming came to stay for the night. He was a kind man, full of faith and warmth, on his way to Mobile, Alabama, with over $400 in donations collected from revival meetings. Samuel Copeland welcomed him gladly, honored to host a man of God. They ate supper, read scripture, and prayed together. But James was watching, listening, calculating. The next morning, Reverend Fleming prepared to leave. He thanked Samuel and mentioned the donations he carried. And then he made his mistake. He asked James for the safest road toward Mobile. The preacher thought he was asking for help. Instead, he had just sealed his fate. James offered to guide him, claiming to know shortcuts through the swamp. Samuel blessed the journey and waved them off, never imagining it would be the last time he saw the Reverend alive. At a remote crossing, James struck. He smashed Fleming's skull with a heavy branch, then finished him with Richardson's knife. This time, it was easier. No hesitation, no trembling hands, just cold efficiency. And before disposing of the body, James repeated the act that had haunted him since Richardson. He severed Fleming's right index finger and wrapped it with the first. 2 victims now, 2 trophies. The birth of a killer. James Copeland had crossed a line. The first killing had been survival, or so he told himself. The second was choice. And with it came a terrible freedom. The preacher's blood stained his hands. His money lined James's pockets. And his finger joined Richardson's in a growing bundle of secrets. Neighbors still saw James as the promising young farmer. Elizabeth still saw him as her suitor. His father still saw him as his pride. But beneath the surface, the man they thought they knew was gone. In his place stood the beginning of something darker. The young farmer had become a hunter. A thief. A killer. And this was only the beginning. To be continued. In Part 3, we'll see how James Copeland's crimes grew bolder, his trophies stranger, and his double life harder to hide. Don't miss the next chapter in this true American horror story. If you're finding this series chilling, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments, would you have trusted James Copeland back then? Right finger word count. Approximately 1030 fits your 1000 word target. Would you like me to now continue with Part 3, where Copeland begins to attract the attention of the outlaws he once feared, and starts building the gang that would terrorize the Pearl River Valley? Part 3, The Trophies of Death. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. What drives a man from killing out of desperation, to killing for pleasure? Tonight, we continue the dark story of James Copeland. In this part, the young Mississippi farmer transforms into something far more terrifying, a predator who begins to collect trophies from his victims. If you thought the first murders were shocking, what happens next will send chills down your spine. James Copeland told himself it was still about survival, still about protecting his identity. But deep down, he knew the truth. The fingers he cut from his victims were no longer about hiding their names. They had become trophies, cold, gruesome reminders of the power he held over life and death. The disappearance of Reverend Fleming proved different from James's earlier victims. Calvin Richardson had been a drifter, a man no one cared much about. But Fleming was a beloved preacher, known across several counties. His vanishing lit southern Mississippi on fire with gossip, panic, and outrage. Churches organized search parties. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another worked side by side, scouring the swamps. Even the state government offered a reward for information. Sheriff Thomas Bullock, already under pressure from Fleming's congregation, now found himself with the eyes of the entire state on his shoulders. And through it all, James Copeland smiled, volunteered, and pretended to be one of the most dedicated searchers. He rode out with groups combing the riverbanks, spent long hours in muddy boots wading through cattails, and even prayed alongside grieving church members. His fiancée, Elizabeth Hartwell, praised his selflessness, telling her father that James was a man of true Christian character. Samuel Copeland, his father, felt a surge of pride. His son wasn't just a hard-working farmer, but now a respected member of the community. None of them knew that Reverend Fleming's body was already gone, fed to the catfish in a dark, deep pool of the Pearl River. The investigation took a new turn when Sheriff Bullock discovered that both Richardson and Fleming had been carrying money when they vanished. Suddenly, a theory began to form. A gang of robbers must be stalking the roads, waiting for wealthy travelers. That idea worried James. 1 missing man could be a mystery. 2 could be bad luck. But 3, that would be a pattern. And patterns drew attention. He needed to be smarter. By December 1844, James was ready for his third victim. This time, the target was Marcus Kellerman, a slave trader on his way north from New Orleans. He was traveling with 15 enslaved men, women, and children chained together as human cargo, and he carried a fat money belt stuffed with gold and silver. When Kellerman's wagon broke down near the Copeland farm, Samuel felt uneasy about the man but offered him shelter, as hospitality demanded. James, however, felt something different. Watching Kellerman drunkenly boast about his profits and slap the enslaved people as if they were animals filled him with disgust. But that disgust quickly twisted into hunger. Hunger for the man's gold. Hunger for the thrill of control. When Kellerman announced that he'd leave before dawn, James offered to guide him through the swamp on a shortcut. That shortcut led straight to death. James's attack on Kellerman was the most brutal yet. He tortured the slave trader, dragging out his suffering, before finishing him off. From the body, he cut the right middle finger for his pouch of trophies. But this time, he wanted more. With pliers, he ripped Kellerman's gold teeth from his mouth. But now James had a bigger problem, the 15 witnesses. The enslaved people had seen James lead their master into the swamp. If they ever told the story, suspicion would point directly to him. James showed them false kindness, saying he would guide them to freedom. Instead, he He abandoned them in the swamp with no food, no water, no knowledge of where to go. Within days, most were dead, claimed by snakes, gators, and the merciless swamp itself. A few survived, but when caught by slave catchers, their desperate story about Kellerman's disappearance was dismissed as nothing more than runaway lies. By 1845, James Copeland had killed 6 people. He had nearly $3,000 in stolen money. And under his bedroom floor, hidden in a leather pouch packed with salt, he kept a growing collection of severed fingers. What had once been a grim necessity was now a ritual. James's killings soon attracted attention from someone even darker. Gideon McCready, a bearded outlaw, leader of a gang that haunted the river parishes of Louisiana and Mississippi. He had first appeared on the edge of James's story when chasing Calvin Richardson. Now, he had heard whispers of mutilations, of missing men whose fingers never turned up with their bodies. He liked what he heard. McCready tested James with quiet meetings, pushing him, probing him. And James impressed him. Smart, careful, merciless. By the spring of 1845, the two had struck a partnership. James provided local knowledge and cover. McCready opened the door to bigger, bloodier crimes. And soon, the Copeland signature, a missing finger, became feared across the Pearl River Valley. But back at home, Elizabeth Hartwell began to notice things. Her fiancé's eyes seemed different now, like a cat staring at a mouse. He spoke less, but when he did, his words often lingered on death, cruelty, and killing. He collected knives and displayed them proudly, pretending they were for farm work. But Elizabeth felt something sinister behind his fascination. The final straw came in August 1845, with the attack on the riverboat Southern Belle. James scouted the ambush site, planned the timing, and helped lead the raid. The boat carried families, children, merchants, and within hours, all were dead. James himself killed at least 3 people, including a young mother. He cut her ring finger and pocketed her wedding band and necklace. The massacre shocked Mississippi. The burned wreckage of the boat was found days later. Federal marshals poured into the region. Rewards were offered. The manhunt grew serious. But James Copeland felt something else. Not fear, not guilt, satisfaction. For the first time, he felt not like a man trying to survive, but a predator who enjoyed the hunt. Yet behind his mask of respectability, cracks began to show. Elizabeth noticed him muttering in his sleep, sometimes crying out as though in pain. He brushed it off, blaming stress from their upcoming wedding. His father, Samuel, thought James was simply working too hard. But in truth, those nights away from the farm were filled with more murders. And with each one, the pouch under the floorboards grew heavier. The man who had once killed in panic was now killing with purpose. And worse, he was beginning to enjoy it. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland had crossed the line from killer to monster. But how far could he go before the law, or his own mind, caught up with him? In the next part of this series, we'll see his crimes grow larger, bolder, and bloodier, until the entire South trembles at his name. If this tale of darkness gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves true crime and horror. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss part 4. The descent into madness has only just begun. Would you like me to also create titles, descriptions, and viral hashtags for part 3 optimized for YouTube search and clicks like we did before? Part 4 Blood on the River. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. By 1845, James Copeland was no longer just a farmer hiding terrible secrets. He was part of a ruthless gang, leaving a trail of death and fear across Mississippi. In this episode, we'll see how his partnership with Gideon McCready turned him into one of the most feared killers in the South. If you thought the Southern Belle Massacre was horrifying, what comes next will shake you to your core. The wreck of the Southern Belle still floated in the minds of every Mississippian. Families whispered about it around dinner tables, preachers thundered about it from pulpits, and federal marshals scoured the river towns, determined to catch whoever was responsible. The crime had been too public, too brutal, to ignore. 12 passengers had been slaughtered. men, women, even children. And the fire that consumed the boat erased almost all evidence. The bodies were burned beyond recognition, the gold and goods stolen, and the killers vanished like ghosts into the swamp. Sheriff Bullock felt the weight of failure crushing him. He had warned about robbers, but even he hadn't imagined something so savage. Now the whole region demanded justice. And through it all, James Copeland walked free. On the surface, James looked like the perfect young man. Engaged to Elizabeth Hartwell, respected by his neighbors, a son his father could be proud of. But underneath, he was a rising star in Gideon McCready's gang. McCready's men weren't just petty thieves. They were highwaymen, smugglers, and killers, operating from Louisiana to Alabama. And with James on their side, they had a powerful advantage: local knowledge. He knew every hidden trail, every bend of the Pearl River, every cabin where supplies could be taken without witnesses. James also brought something else: his reputation for cold brutality. Word spread quickly in the outlaw world about the young man who cut off fingers and kept them as trophies. Some criminals laughed at the rumor. Others shivered when they heard it. But all agreed on one thing: James Copeland was not a man to cross. The gang's crimes grew bolder. They robbed wealthy planters traveling between towns. They hijacked wagons carrying goods to Natchez. They raided small riverboats, stripping them of cargo and then sinking them to erase evidence. James was always in the middle of it. His sharp mind helped plan ambushes, but his thirst for violence often drove the killings. He no longer killed just to silence witnesses. He killed because he wanted to. One chilling story told of a merchant couple traveling with their teenage son. After the robbery, McCready wanted to let them go. They had already taken their money and goods. But James argued otherwise. If they live, he said coldly, they'll talk. The family begged for mercy. The mother offered her wedding ring, the boy promised silence. None of it mattered. James cut them down himself, taking the woman's finger for his pouch. The gang members said nothing, but from that day on, they looked at James with both fear and respect. Back in Columbia, Elizabeth Hartwell noticed the changes more clearly. James's visits became shorter, his excuses stranger. He claimed to be away on business, arranging to buy new farming equipment. But his hands, once rough from fieldwork, now bore calluses from handling weapons. His eyes had a glassy, restless look, as if he were never fully present. Elizabeth confessed her unease to her father, Judge Hartwell. The judge dismissed it at first, telling her all young men carried stress before marriage. But when James showed up one Sunday wearing a fine coat she knew he could not have afforded, she felt her stomach twist with fear. Where was he getting the money? Meanwhile, federal investigators were closing in. Reports of robberies and killings formed a bloody map across southern Mississippi. And though no one dared say his name, James's shadow loomed behind many of them. Sheriff Bullock began to notice that James was present in town just before or after several incidents. Too much of a coincidence. But with no proof, Bullock held his tongue. The gang, however, was restless. McCready warned James that the Southern Belle massacre had stirred up too much heat. They needed to lie low, to avoid attention until the search cooled. James disagreed. His hunger for killing had grown too strong. He wanted more. More money, more trophies, more blood. It was the beginning of a dangerous rift. In the summer of 1846, the gang struck again. This time targeting a wealthy plantation owner traveling with 3 slaves. The man had been boasting in town about carrying a chest of silver plate back to his estate. That night, he vanished on the road. His body was later found in the swamp, stripped and mutilated. His slaves were never seen again. Locals whispered of fingerless corpses, and cursed the devil for walking among them. But criminals whispered something else. James Copeland was becoming more terrifying than Gideon McCready himself. Elizabeth's fears finally boiled over. One evening, she confronted James, demanding to know why he disappeared for days, why he carried weapons, why he sometimes woke screaming in the night. For a moment, James softened. He kissed her hand and promised that after they were married, everything would change. But Elizabeth saw the glint in his eyes, a flash of something dark and cruel. She didn't believe him anymore. That autumn, she broke off the engagement. Judge Hartwell supported her decision, and Elizabeth eventually married another man, a lawyer named Camden. But James never forgot her. In his twisted mind, Elizabeth remained the one light he had lost, the only soul who might have saved him from what he was becoming. By 1847, James Copeland was no longer a farmer's son. He was a full outlaw, hunted by sheriffs, marshals, and bounty hunters. His crimes stretched across counties, leaving behind burned wagons, robbed travelers, and mutilated bodies. But the story of James Copeland was far from over. Because soon, his path would cross with new allies, darker betrayals, and an inevitable showdown with the law. And when the law finally caught up, James would reveal every bloody detail in a confession that still chills historians today. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland's name was now whispered with fear across Mississippi. But how long could he run before the law cornered him? In Part 5, we'll follow his gang's rise, and the beginning of his downfall. If this tale kept you on edge, share it with a friend who loves chilling history, smash that like button, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this horrifying saga. The blood on the river is only the beginning. Would you like me to also draft SEO titles, video descriptions, and hashtags for Part 4 like I did with earlier parts so you can post them directly on YouTube? Part 5 The Devil's Apprentice. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. James Copeland's crimes had already scarred Mississippi, but his story was only getting darker. By 1847, he was no longer just a killer, he was a legend among outlaws, a man feared even by other criminals. In this episode, we'll uncover how James became a leader in a gang of murderers, how betrayal stalked him at every turn, and how whispers of the devil began to follow his name. The Pearl River Valley was drowning in fear. Merchants, travelers, even preachers avoided the swamp roads unless they rode in large groups. Farmers locked their doors at night and prayed the gang would not come calling. Mothers warned their children never to stray far from home. Everyone had heard of the mutilated bodies, the missing fingers, the families that vanished without a trace. But no one dared speak James Copeland's name too loudly. Inside the gang, Copeland's influence was growing. Gideon McCready was still the leader, but James was the spark, the one with new ideas, new plans. He suggested targeting male coaches carrying cash for banks. He pointed out that plantations often moved silver and jewelry during harvest season. He even taught the gang how to scatter false trails, confusing the bloodhounds sent after them. The other men admired his cleverness, but they also feared his cruelty. One outlaw, a young recruit named Elias, made the mistake of mocking James for his finger trophies. He laughed that Copeland carried them like charms, like a superstitious woman with beads. James said nothing in the moment. But that night, Elias disappeared. His body was found 2 weeks later, floating in the river. His right hand was missing. The message was clear: James Copeland was not to be mocked. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Hartwell, now Elizabeth Camden, was trying to forget him. She had married a lawyer, and though her life was secure, she could not shake the memory of her former fiancé. She sometimes dreamed of him, standing outside her window, watching her with those cold blue eyes. And perhaps it was not only a dream. Neighbors whispered that they saw James lurking near Columbia, even though he was wanted across the state. One woman claimed she saw him outside the church on a Sunday morning, watching Elizabeth and her new husband as they left the service. Elizabeth never spoke of it, but she felt the shadow of James Copeland for the rest of her life. By 1848, the gang's reputation was spreading beyond Mississippi. Newspapers in New Orleans, Mobile, and Natchez printed lurid stories of the finger taker, a killer who left mutilated corpses as his calling card. Some said he was possessed by the devil himself, a man who killed not for money, but for pleasure. James did little to deny these rumors. In fact, he leaned into them. He wore black more often. He carried multiple knives, polished to a gleam. He sometimes carved strange marks into trees near his victims, as if signing his name in the wilderness. The outlaw world began to treat him not just as a man, but as a dark legend, half human, half nightmare. But inside the gang, trouble was brewing. McCready was older, cautious, thinking about retirement. James was young, ambitious, and reckless. Their visions clashed constantly. McCready wanted smaller jobs, safer jobs, quick robberies that would keep them fed without drawing federal attention. James wanted more. Bigger hauls. Bloodier spectacles. The breaking point came with the raid on a plantation near the Pascagoula River. McCready only intended to steal horses and supplies. James turned it into a massacre. The planter and his wife were slaughtered, their throats cut while their children screamed. The house was set on fire, burning the family alive inside. Even hardened outlaws were shaken. "Boys gone mad," one whispered. "Ain't no money worth this kind of heat." But others, especially the younger, hungrier men, were drawn to James's ferocity. They began to see him as the true leader. McCready sensed his control slipping away. Meanwhile, the law was circling closer. Federal marshals had compiled a list of suspects, and James's name was moving toward the top. Sheriff Bullock, who had once admired the young farmer, now carried a private rage against him. He swore to bring Copeland in alive, to make him face justice for the butchered families and burned boats. But catching him was another matter. The swamps were James's kingdom. His gang moved like ghosts, vanishing into the cypress and reappearing miles away. The authorities offered rewards, but no one dared betray him. Too many feared they'd end up like Elias, floating in the river, handless. James, however, was beginning to believe his own legend. He bragged to the gang that bullets could not kill him. He claimed he had made a pact with dark forces in the swamp, that the devil himself walked at his side. Some laughed nervously, others began to believe. On moonless nights, James would perform strange rituals. He'd lay out the severed fingers, whisper over them, and drink whiskey until he collapsed. Men said they heard him muttering in languages they didn't recognize, calling on spirits for protection. Whether it was madness, showmanship, or true belief, no one could say. But it worked. His men followed him with a mixture of loyalty and terror. In 1849, James led his most daring raid yet. A stagecoach loaded with payroll money for a regiment of soldiers was traveling near Mobile. Copeland's gang ambushed it, killing the guards and making off with over $10,000 in cash and gold. It was the richest score they had ever taken. But it was also their biggest mistake. The U.S. Army itself now wanted James Copeland. From this point, the story shifts. James was no longer a hidden shadow in the swamp. He was a hunted outlaw, his name spread across the South, his face sketched on wanted posters. Some men in the gang began to question if following him was worth it. Others wanted the reward money for themselves. And Gideon McCready, the old leader, was quietly plotting a betrayal that would shake James Copeland's bloody empire to its core. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. The Devil's Apprentice was becoming too powerful, and even his allies were beginning to fear him. In Part 6, we'll uncover the betrayal that turned Copeland's own men against him, and the violent revenge that followed. If this story gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves true crime and horror history, hit that like button, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because when outlaws turn on each other, the blood runs even deeper. Would you like me to also create a YouTube-optimized title, description, and viral hashtags for Part 5 so you can upload it directly? Part 6 Betrayal in the Swamp. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. What happens when a killer so feared, so ruthless, begins to terrify even his own gang? By 1850, James Copeland had become more monster than man. But every legend, no matter how dark, eventually faces betrayal. Tonight, we'll uncover how the gang he built turned against him, and how blood spilled thicker than ever before in the swamps of Mississippi. By the dawn of the 1850s, James Copeland was a name spoken with dread across 3 states. Farmers whispered of him over supper. Merchants traveled in convoys, armed to the teeth. And mothers hushed their children with warnings of the man who takes fingers. But the legend was beginning to eat itself alive. Copeland's gang, once united under Gideon McCready, was splintering. Some wanted to retire rich. Others feared the law was closing in. And a few believed James had gone too far, dragging them into bloodshed that brought federal marshals and bounty hunters to every corner of the Pearl River Valley. At the center of this storm was the uneasy partnership between Gideon and James. A leader divided. Gideon McCready had built the gang slowly, carefully, keeping to robberies that paid well but didn't stir too much attention. His philosophy was simple: steal, hide, survive. James Copeland thought differently. He wasn't satisfied with survival. He wanted dominance. He wanted terror. His killings weren't just about money anymore, they were about reputation. Fear was his currency. The gang began to split into camps. Older men, loyal to Gideon, muttered that James was leading them to ruin. Younger men, drunk on the outlaw's charisma, swore they'd follow him into hell itself. And in a way, they already had. The ambush at Pine Hollow. The breaking point came with the Pine Hollow raid. A rumor had spread that a wealthy planter was moving payroll money for his workers, nearly $15,000 in silver, through the back roads. Gideon argued against touching it. Too much risk, too much attention. James sneered. You want to steal chickens till you die old and broke, Gideon? Or do you want people to remember your name? The gang followed James. They struck at dusk, overwhelming the planter's guards and seizing the silver. But James wasn't done. He ordered the farmhouse torched, trapping the planter's wife and daughters inside while his men carried the loot away. The screams haunted even the most hardened of the crew. Gideon himself turned pale, spitting in the dirt as the flames licked the night sky. This ain't robbery, he growled. This is damnation. From that night forward, Gideon resolved that James Copeland's reign had to end. Whispers of betrayal. The first cracks appeared when a bounty hunter from Alabama nearly caught them. Someone had tipped off the law about their hideout, forcing the gang to scatter. James suspected Gideon. Gideon suspected James. Everyone suspected everyone else. The paranoia grew unbearable. At night, James kept his knives laid out beside him as he slept. Men reported hearing him mutter in his dreams, cursing Gideon's name. Gideon, meanwhile, began holding secret talks with marshals, offering them information in exchange for amnesty. But he underestimated how sharp James's instincts had become. One evening, as the gang gathered near a campfire in the swamp, James rose and fixed Gideon with those icy blue eyes. "You been talking," he said flatly. Gideon's hand twitched toward his pistol, but James was faster. In one motion, he hurled a knife across the fire. It buried itself in Gideon's chest. The old outlaw staggered, gasped, and fell into the flames. The gang froze. James stood, voice low and steady. "Any man here still loyal to Gideon, step forward now." No one moved. From that moment on, the gang was his. The devil's ritual. But victory came at a cost. Killing Gideon didn't ease James's paranoia. It deepened it. He no longer trusted even the men who followed him. He kept the gang in motion constantly, raiding one week, hiding the next, never sleeping in the same place twice. And the rituals grew worse. The leather pouch of fingers had become swollen with grisly trophies. James sometimes laid them out in a circle, whispering prayers in the dark. He claimed the severed flesh gave him power, that the devil himself spoke through them. Some men laughed nervously, others crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. But none dared defy him. The Bayou Betrayal. It was one of his own lieutenants who finally broke. A man named Silas Green. Silas had ridden with James for 2 years, watching him butcher families and burn farms. At first, the gold was enough to quiet his conscience. But after Gideon's death, Silas knew they were all living on borrowed time. So he made a choice. He rode to Mobile and struck a deal with the marshals. He would deliver James Copeland, alive or dead. The trap was set in the spring of 1851. Silas lured James and a handful of men to a cabin on the edge of the Pascagoula swamp, claiming it was a safe house with supplies. Instead, marshals were waiting in the shadows. The ambush erupted in gunfire. 2 of James's men fell instantly. James himself fought like a demon, cutting down one marshal with a slash of his knife before leaping through a window into the night. He escaped, wounded but alive. Silas was less fortunate. Days later, his body was found hanging from a cypress tree, throat cut, his right hand missing. James Copeland had survived betrayal. And now, vengeance burned in his heart. The bloodiest years. What followed were the bloodiest years of his career. Between 1851 and 1854, James and his shrinking circle of loyal men carried out raids so savage they shocked even hardened criminals. Plantations burned. Travelers vanished. Entire families were wiped out. The fingers kept piling up. Some said, James no longer killed for money at all, that he was simply feeding the darkness inside him. The law hunted him harder than ever. Rewards grew higher. Posses scoured the swamps. But James Copeland seemed untouchable, a phantom who slipped through every noose. And yet, fate was tightening around him. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland had beaten betrayal, slaughtered his rivals, and grown more feared than ever. But no outlaw escapes forever. In Part 7, we'll see how James's arrogance brought him face to face with justice, and how the hunt for the finger taker became one of the most relentless manhunts in Southern history. If this story chilled you, hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves true crime, and subscribe so you don't miss Part 7. Because the swamp that once protected James Copeland was about to turn against him. Part 7: The Hunt for the Finger Taker. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. By 1855, James Copeland had become the most wanted outlaw in the South. His name alone sent chills through Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. But when lawmen, bounty hunters, and even his own family turned against him, the swamp that once protected him began to close in. This is the story of the manhunt that brought the finger taker to his knees. The most wanted man in the South. James Copeland's crimes had grown so savage that newspapers refused to print the full details. Too horrifying, they said. Entire families disappeared. Bodies were found mutilated, their fingers missing. Travelers whispered of a ghostly rider who vanished into the swamp mist. By 1855, the governor of Mississippi placed a reward of $5,000 on Copeland's head, alive or dead. That was a fortune back then, enough to make bounty hunters flood the state in droves. For the first time, Copeland felt the pressure of the noose tightening. A family torn apart. James still returned, from time to his father's farm. But those visits had turned from warm reunions to tense confrontations. Samuel Copeland had once been proud of his son, believing the money came from cattle or trade. But by now, the truth was impossible to hide. The whispers reached him. His son was a killer, a thief, and worse, a man cursed by the devil. One stormy night, Samuel begged James to stop. The Lord will not forgive you. You've spilled too much blood. Better to hang than burn in hellfire. James's cold stare silenced him. He left without another word, disappearing into the swamp. That was the last time Samuel ever saw his son alive. Lawmen close in. The marshals were smarter now. No more riding in uniform or marching in groups. Instead, they disguised themselves as traders, woodsmen, even beggars. They built networks of informants, slaves on plantations, poor farmers, barkeepers, anyone who had glimpsed the outlaw. Rumors spread that James had been seen near Mobile. Others claimed he'd taken refuge in New Orleans, hiding among gamblers and cutthroats. But the truth was simpler. He was still in the swamp, his kingdom of cypress and shadow. And it was in those shadows that the hunters came. The betrayal of a friend. It was a man named David Williams, once a close ally, who set the trap. Williams had ridden with Copeland for years but grew tired of living like a hunted animal. The promise of amnesty, and a slice of that $5,000 reward, was too tempting. So he sent word to the marshals. James would be meeting him at a cabin along Red Creek, a place he thought safe. The night of the meeting, James arrived cautious but confident. His knife was strapped to his thigh, and his pouch of fingers thumped against his chest. But something felt wrong. The forest was too still. Even the frogs had gone silent. When Williams stepped from the cabin, James knew. "You sold me," he whispered. Before Williams could answer, the marshals swarmed. The fight at Red Creek. Gunfire split the night. Sparks lit the swamp as bullets tore through the trees. James fought like a cornered wolf, his knife flashing in the moonlight. He cut one marshal's throat and shot another point blank with a stolen pistol. But numbers overwhelmed him. A bullet tore into his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Another shattered his leg. Still, he crawled, dragging himself toward the black waters of Red Creek. If he could just reach the swamp, he might vanish again. But a boot slammed onto his back. A marshal leaned down, pressing the barrel of his gun to James's skull. End of the line, Copeland. For the first time in years, James smiled. "You think you've got me?" he rasped. "The devil ain't done with me yet." Captured at last. They bound him in chains, hauling him through the mud like a slaughtered hog. Williams wouldn't meet his eyes. The once loyal friend now stood apart, trembling as James laughed, a low, broken sound that chilled everyone present. At the jail in Augusta, Mississippi, crowds gathered just to see him. Mothers clutched their children, pointing at the outlaw who had haunted their nightmares. Ministers shouted for repentance. But James sat in silence, his blue eyes cold as winter steel. The devil's bargain. In the weeks before trial, rumors spread that James had made a pact with the devil. Guards claimed he never slept, only muttered to himself in the dark, clutching something hidden under his prison blanket. When they searched his cell, they found it, the pouch. Inside were the shriveled, blackened fingers of his victims. Even hardened lawmen turned pale, crossing themselves as they threw it into the fire. James only laughed, saying, "Burn the flesh, the soul still answers." Trial of the century. The courthouse overflowed. Farmers, merchants, gamblers, even children packed the benches. Newspapers called it the trial of the century. Witness after witness came forward. Victims who had escaped, families of the slain, former gang members eager to save themselves. The evidence was overwhelming. James Copeland was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. But even as the judge declared the sentence, James leaned forward with a chilling grin. "You can hang me, but you can't kill me. My soul's already promised." The crowd shivered. Some swore the candles in the courtroom flickered as he spoke, though no wind stirred. Awaiting the gallows. In the days leading to his execution, preachers visited his cell, begging him to repent. James only sneered. "Repent? For what? I did what others feared to do. I'll die with gold in my pockets and the devil at my side." But deep down, cracks showed. At night, he woke screaming, clutching at invisible hands. Guards swore they heard voices whispering in the cell, voices that weren't human. The swamp outside seemed to call for him, the cypress trees groaning in the wind like the cries of his victims. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland had been captured. Sentenced. His days were numbered. But the story didn't end at the gallows. In Part 8, we'll walk through his final hours, his last words, his last breath, and the chilling legend that followed him even after death. If this tale gripped you, smash that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss Part 8. Because death was not the end of James Copeland's horror, it was only the beginning. Part 8: The Gallows of Augusta. Clapperboard hook for YouTube intro. On October 30, 1857, the people of Mississippi gathered to watch the execution of James Copeland, the most feared outlaw in the South. But when the hangman's rope tightened around his neck, what happened next only deepened the legend of the finger taker. The morning of death. Dawn broke cold and gray over Augusta, Mississippi. Word had spread for weeks. James Copeland, leader of the infamous Copeland gang, would hang today. By sunrise, wagons and horseback riders clogged every road leading into town. Families packed picnic baskets, as if execution day were a festival. Ministers held prayer circles. Children climbed trees for a better view of the gallows. Sheriff William Henderson tightened security, stationing armed men on every corner. This was no ordinary hanging. This was the end of a nightmare that had haunted the South for over a decade. Inside the jail, James sat quietly on his cot. He hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his piercing blue eyes, but his posture was calm, almost regal. As the guards entered, he smirked. "So, it's the devil's sunrise," he said. The confession that shook the jail. Before being led to the gallows, James was given one last chance to speak. Sheriff Henderson pressed him, reminding him that the truth might ease his soul. At first, silence. Then, suddenly, James began to talk. For hours he confessed. 40 murders, maybe more. Names, places, details that chilled the blood. He spoke of Reverend Fleming's body sinking in the Pearl River, of Marcus Kellerman's screams in the swamp, of the Southern Belle massacre where even children were slaughtered. He admitted to keeping the fingers as trophies, a sign of his power over life and death. The guards who listened were hardened men, but several crossed themselves, shaken to the core. One later wrote, "It was as if Satan himself had borrowed the outlaw's tongue." When asked if he felt remorse, James only grinned. "Regret is for the weak. I lived as I pleased." The procession to the gallows. By mid-morning, the jail doors creaked open. Shackled and flanked by deputies, James Copeland stepped into the sunlight. A roar rose from the crowd, cheers, curses, prayers. Some threw stones, others spat, but James walked tall, his chains clinking with each step. He wore a clean white shirt, freshly pressed trousers, and boots polished to a shine. He looked less like a criminal and more like a groom on his wedding day. The gallows loomed in the town square, its timber beams stark against the sky. The rope swung gently in the breeze, waiting. James tilted his head back and laughed. "Is that the best you can do? One rope, the preacher's plea. Before the hanging, Reverend Elijah Moore was allowed to address him. Standing at the foot of the scaffold, the preacher begged James to repent, to surrender his soul to God. "Confess your sins, son. Even now, mercy is within reach." James's blue eyes gleamed. "I made my peace long ago, preacher. Not with your God, but with another. When that trapdoor opens, I don't fall, I rise." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some shouted for his immediate death. Others murmured in fear, crossing themselves. The last words of a killer. At the top of the scaffold, the hangman adjusted the rope, tightening the noose around James's neck. Sheriff Henderson asked if he had any final words. James grinned one last time, his voice booming across the silent crowd. "You think this ends me? No rope can strangle the devil's hand. My name will haunt these swamps long after your bones turn to dust." He paused, his grin widening. "And Elizabeth, tell her I never stopped watching." A shiver spread through the crowd. Elizabeth Hartwell, his former fiancée, was far away by then, but the words clung like a curse. The drop. The hangman pulled the lever. The trapdoor crashed open. James fell. The rope snapped taut. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the sound of cracking bone. His body twitched, shuddered, and finally went still. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, weeping. Mothers hugged their children. Men shook hands, declaring justice done. But some swore they saw his eyes open in that final moment, glowing pale and unearthly, as if something inside refused to die. The body of James Copeland. Tradition called for the body to be buried in secret, to prevent criminals from idolizing him. Yet locals demanded proof that the finger-taker was truly gone. The corpse was displayed for hours, thousands filing past to see the outlaw's slack face and broken neck. Some jeered, some spat, others touched the coffin for luck. Finally, under heavy guard, James Copeland was buried in an unmarked grave outside Augusta. But even in death, rumors refused to rest. The legend begins. Within days, stories spread. Some said the devil himself came for Copeland's soul, seen riding a black horse through the cemetery at midnight. Others claimed the swamp erupted in howls the night of his death, as if the cypress trees mourned their dark prince. A month later, a fisherman swore he saw James's pale face rise from the Pearl River, dripping with water and mud, his blue eyes shining in the moonlight. Farmers whispered of hoofprints burned into the ground near the gallows, prints no ordinary horse could make. And travelers through the swamps swore they heard the sound of chains dragging through the mist, followed by a whisper, "Elizabeth." Fear that never died. Though James Copeland was gone, the legend only grew stronger. Parents warned their children, "Behave, or Copeland's ghost will take your fingers in the night." The marshes of Mississippi became known as haunted ground. Even today, locals say the swamp is cursed, that sometimes, in the fog, you can hear laughter, the same laugh James Copeland carried to the gallows. And some believe his soul still lingers, bound not to heaven or hell, but to the very land he terrorized. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland's body swung from the gallows, but the horror didn't die with him. In Part 9, we'll explore the ghost stories, sightings, and dark folklore that grew after his death, tales so chilling they're still whispered around campfires in Mississippi today. If this gave you goosebumps, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss Part 9 of this nightmare. Because the legend of the finger taker was only just beginning. Part 9: The Curse of James Copeland. Clapperboard hook YouTube intro. They buried James Copeland in an unmarked grave after his hanging in 1857, but the people of Mississippi swore he never stayed buried. From ghostly whispers in the swamps to cursed treasures and strange deaths, the finger taker returned in legend, and maybe in spirit. The first night after the hanging. On the night of October 30, 1857, the people of Augusta tried to sleep soundly, believing evil had been put to rest. But the swamp had other plans. A thunderstorm rolled through, shaking the wooden homes of the town. In the cemetery, where Copeland's body lay beneath the dirt, lightning struck an oak tree so violently it split in two. Locals who saw the flash swore they heard a scream carried on the wind, a sound not of nature, but of a man's final laugh echoing from the grave. By morning, children whispered that the devil had come to claim his favorite son. The fingers that wouldn't rot. Weeks after the execution, Sheriff Henderson ordered the outlaw's belongings destroyed. But one thing was missing: the pouch of severed fingers Copeland had collected over the years. Rumors spread that a deputy had kept the pouch, believing the grisly souvenirs might fetch a high price among collectors of the macabre. Within days, that deputy fell ill with fever, sweating and raving until he died. His family swore that before the end, he screamed about, fingers scratching at the walls, and a voice whispering his name. The pouch was never found. Some say it's still buried somewhere in the Pearl River swamp, cursed gold and severed flesh waiting to damn anyone who touches it. Elizabeth's torment. Far away in Columbia, Elizabeth Hartwell, once James Copeland's fiancée, was trying to rebuild her life. She had married a lawyer named Camden, a good and decent man. Yet peace never came. Elizabeth reported waking in the night to hear chains dragging across the floorboards. Sometimes, in the silence, she swore she heard her name whispered, "Elizabeth, Elizabeth." Servants in the Camden household claimed they saw muddy footprints appear in the hall, leading to Elizabeth's door, though no one had entered. One night, Elizabeth woke to see a pale face at her window, blue eyes staring at her through the glass, a smile too cruel to be human. She screamed, and when her husband rushed to her side, nothing remained but fog drifting away into the night. The swamp becomes haunted ground. By 1858, stories of James Copeland's ghost spread through Mississippi like wildfire. Hunters claimed they saw a tall figure moving through the mist, always near the cypress trees where the Pearl River bends. Fishermen heard laughter across the water at midnight, followed by splashes as if something, or someone, rose from the depths. One farmer traveling home late swore a man in chains stepped into the road, blocking his horse. The figure's face was pale, the lips curled in a grin, and when the farmer raised his lantern, the apparition vanished, leaving only the smell of rotting swamp water. Soon, parents used Copeland's name to frighten their children into obedience. Sleep now, or the finger taker will come. The Southern Belle Curse. 3 years after the massacre of the Southern Belle steamboat, salvagers tried to recover its sunken cargo. They pulled crates of fine cloth, barrels of sugar, and even a safe filled with coins. But every man involved in the salvage died within a year, one in a fire, another by drowning, a third in a sudden fit of madness. Locals called it Copeland's revenge. They said his victims still cried out from the riverbed, their blood soaking the waters, cursing anyone who tried to profit from their deaths. The burning tree of Pearl River. In 1862, during the Civil War, Confederate soldiers camped along the Pearl River reported strange happenings near an ancient cypress. At night, they heard footsteps circling their camp. One man swore a cold hand gripped his ankle while he slept, though no one was there. Then, one stormy night, lightning struck the cypress. Instead of burning away, the tree burned from the inside out, glowing like a lantern for 3 days. Soldiers believed it was a sign that James Copeland's soul had taken root in the swamp, forever tied to the land he terrorized. Even today, locals point to a charred stump near the river and call it Copeland's torch. Elizabeth's final encounter. By 1865, Elizabeth Camden was a widow, her husband having died of fever during the war. She lived alone in a large house, and neighbors noticed her health declining. She spoke little, but her servants whispered that she still felt the presence of James Copeland. One stormy night, she vanished. Her bed was found empty, the sheets twisted as if she had struggled. The window was open, muddy footprints leading out into the garden. They searched for days, but her body was never recovered. Some said she ran away in madness. Others believed the outlaw's spirit had finally come to claim the woman he once loved. The legend lives on. By the late 19th century, the story of James Copeland was no longer just history, it was folklore. Campfires across Mississippi carried his name, each tale darker than the last. Travelers swore they saw his ghost leading lost souls into the swamp, never to return. Families who lived near the Pearl River claimed to hear a man whistling at night, a tune Copeland was known to hum before a killing. And always, the stories ended the same way, with a pale hand reaching out of the dark, missing a finger, searching for another victim. The chilling truth. Skeptics dismiss the stories as superstition, the natural result of trauma and fear. But too many coincidences linger. Too many strange deaths. Too many sightings of blue eyes glowing in the fog. Whether ghost or curse, James Copeland never truly left Pearl River County. His legend grew stronger than the man himself, feeding on fear, keeping his memory alive long after the hangman's rope should have ended it. Pushpin cliffhanger outro for YouTube. James Copeland may have died on the gallows, but his curse lived on. And in part 10, we'll uncover the final and most disturbing chapter, the modern encounters. From paranormal investigators to terrified locals, people claim the finger taker still walks among us. If this gave you chills, hit like, share it with a friend who loves haunted history, and subscribe so you won't miss the final chapter in this terrifying saga. Because some evils never stay buried. Part 10 The Finger Taker Lives On. Clapperboard Hook YouTube intro. More than 150 years have passed since James Copeland swung from the gallows, yet his ghost still lingers in Mississippi's swamps. From strange deaths to modern ghost hunts, the finger taker's legend refuses to die. But what if he never left? What if he's still waiting for you? A legend that wouldn't die. The 19th century passed into the 20th, but James Copeland's name never faded. In Mississippi, every generation told the story a little differently. Some remembered him as a criminal, others as a dark spirit tied to the land. And some swore he was both, an outlaw who had sold his soul to the devil, cursed to wander forever. Children grew up daring each other to whisper his name 3 times at night beside the Pearl River. Hunters refused to go out during storms, fearing his ghost would appear. The outlaw had become more than a man. He had become Mississippi's boogeyman. The 1922 Pearl River Flood. In 1922, the Pearl River flooded, drowning homes and farmlands. Survivors spoke of strange things in the water. One woman claimed she saw hands, pale, bloated hands, reaching up from beneath the flood, grasping at her boat. Another man swore he heard laughter carried on the wind as the waters swallowed whole families. Afterward, old-timers nodded knowingly. "It's Copeland," they whispered. "He's still hungry. The treasure hunters." By the 1950s, thrill seekers and historians began searching for Copeland's rumored treasure, the stolen gold, silver, and jewels hidden in the Pearl River swamp. 2 young men from Hattiesburg vanished during one such expedition. Their boat was found drifting empty near the charred stump called Copeland's torch. Inside the boat were muddy footprints that didn't match either of the missing men. Weeks later, a fisherman pulled a bloated body from the river. The corpse's hands had been cut off at the wrist. The second man was never found. Locals shook their heads. "He takes what's his," they said. "He always takes. The ghost hunters of 1979. In 1979, a small group of amateur ghost hunters traveled to Pearl River County with tape recorders and cameras, determined to prove the legend of James Copeland was real. They camped near the site where he was hanged, setting up equipment through the night. At midnight, their audio tapes picked up something chilling, chains dragging, whispers calling their names, and a faint whistling tune. One of the hunters, a woman named Caroline, later reported seeing a tall man standing just beyond the firelight. She described pale skin, dark hair, and a cruel smile. When she blinked, he was gone. By morning, they discovered deep gouges in the trees surrounding their camp, as though claws had torn through the bark. Their photographs were ruined, covered in strange white streaks and blurred shapes. They left Mississippi swearing never to return. Caroline told reporters, "He's still here. He doesn't want us watching him." Elizabeth's house revisited. In 1995, paranormal investigators explored the ruins of the Camden home, where Elizabeth, Copeland's lost fiancée, had lived. The house was decayed, its windows broken, vines strangling the wood. Inside, they reported cold spots, the sound of footsteps upstairs, and, most terrifying of all, the faint sobbing of a woman echoing through the halls. When one investigator climbed to the attic, she found an old mirror cracked down the center. She swore she saw not her own reflection, but a man's face staring back, blue eyes burning like ice, lips twisted in a smile. The team fled, abandoning half their equipment. Modern sightings. Even in the 21st century, Copeland's name still haunts Mississippi. Locals along the Pearl River tell of headlights flickering and engines dying near the swamp road. Travelers claim to see a man walking along the highway, only for him to vanish when they stop. In 2012, a hunter reported being dragged into the water by something cold that grabbed his ankle. He escaped, but his leg was left bruised and scratched, as though by shackled fingers. Ghost tours in Mississippi often end their nights with the same warning: if you feel the wind turn cold, if you hear someone whistling in the dark, run. James Copeland is near. The Finger Taker's Curse. The strangest part of Copeland's legend is his obsession with fingers. Even today, strange accidents near Pearl River seem tied to him. In 2017, a man using a chainsaw to clear land by the swamp lost 2 fingers in an accident. When paramedics asked how it happened, he claimed his hand had been pulled. His final words before slipping into unconsciousness: "He took them. The finger taker took them." Coincidence? Maybe. But locals say otherwise. The final warning. Historians say James Copeland was just a criminal who met justice on the gallows. Skeptics claim ghost stories are born from fear, not truth. But those who live near Pearl River know better. They say his spirit is bound to the land, by the fingers he took, by the blood he spilled, by the swamp that swallowed his secrets. They say the finger taker waits in the mist, smiling, watching, ready to claim anyone foolish enough to seek him. And perhaps, tonight, as you listen to this story, you feel it too. The sudden chill, the sense that someone is standing just behind you. Pushpin final outro for YouTube. That concludes our 10-part journey into the dark and bloody history of James Copeland, the outlaw who became a legend, and the legend who became a curse. But the question remains, was he just a man? Or is his ghost still out there, hunting, taking, and laughing in the shadows of the Mississippi swamp? If this story chilled your spine, don't let it end here. Right finger hit subscribe for more terrifying historic tales. Right finger like this video if you felt the chill of Copeland's ghost. Right finger and share it with a friend, if you dare. Because evil men die, but evil legends live forever.